A woman steps onto a commuter train in Vienna. Blonde hair, designer sunglasses, a small rolling suitcase that bumps lightly against the doorway as she boards. She moves down the aisle of the second-class carriage, picks an open seat, settles in, and flips open a magazine like she has done it 100 times before. Her posture is casual, almost bored, legs crossed, fingers turning pages without hurry. Across from her, on the other side of the aisle, a man in his 40s reads a newspaper in Arabic. He sits straight, gray suit pressed, leather briefcase balanced near his feet. Every few minutes he checks his watch, as if measuring the journey in small, tense increments. To everyone else riding this train, the two look like strangers who happened to land in the same carriage on a routine trip out of Vienna. Nothing links them. Nothing stands out. And no one on board has the faintest idea that in 90 minutes one of these two people will not be alive. The man is called Khalid Masri, though that is only one of 17 names he has slipped into over the past decade. Hamas knows him as Abu Faisal, the man who pushes millions through shell firms scattered across Cyprus, Turkey, and the Gulf states. Mossad tags him as Echo 7, a target marked for removal with full approval from the highest levels of Israeli leadership. And for the woman sitting nearby, he is the reason she has spent 3 years living under deep cover across Europe, changing faces and habits until her real one feels distant. Her real name has lost its meaning. She has worn so many identities that the original feels like a faded story someone once told her. Today she travels as Catherine Mueller, a marketing consultant from Munich on her way to Salzburg for a client meeting that does not exist. Yesterday she used the name Simone Benier, working as a French translator. A month earlier she moved through Prague as Elena Novak, a Czech journalist chasing a made-up story. These layers stack on each other like pages from a book that can never be shut. Under every alias, she remains what she has been for years, a Mossad Operative, part of Mossad's sharpest circle of assassins. And she has followed Khalid Masri for 23 months, tracking flights, bank transfers, hotel bookings, and brief meetings held in quiet corners of crowded cities. Each move led her closer to this morning, to this carriage, to this space where the distance between hunter and target has narrowed to a few steps. What follows is not just a story of one killing. It is the story of how intelligence agencies shape violence into something that looks controlled, almost clinical. How a single operative can drift through European streets unnoticed for years, waiting for a window that might last only seconds. How death can slide into a public space, take a seat, open a magazine, and look like any other traveler until the moment the work is done.
It shows the machinery behind a modern operation where an assassin does not need dramatic acts, only small, precise motions carried out at the right time. Violence becomes something quiet, almost polite, stripped of noise until no one realizes what happened until long after. To understand why Khalid ends up on this train and why his life must end on it, you need to see the path that shaped him. He was born in 1968 in the Bureij refugee camp in Gaza. The camp sat under the weight of occupation, its streets packed, its future narrow. His father worked long days on Israeli construction sites and came home worn down, carrying frustration he never voiced. His mother kept 6 children fed inside a cramped 2-room concrete home with no running water and barely any privacy. From a young age, Khalid learned the rules required to get through each day. You watched Israeli patrols. You memorized when checkpoints shifted. You learned which soldiers took bribes and which ones searched for reasons to haul you off. Survival was a mix of caution, math, and instinct. He had a sharp mind and pushed himself through school, finishing at the top even though the classrooms were half broken and the books older than he was. He picked up English by listening to BBC broadcasts on a smuggled transistor radio, repeating phrases quietly until the sounds made sense. This early world shaped him, sharpened him, and pushed him toward the work he would do later. It also set him on a path that eventually put him on this Vienna train, unaware that the woman reading across from him has built her entire life around ending his. He picked up Hebrew by reading Israeli newspapers he pulled from trash bins near military sites. He spent hours with those papers, sounding out words and matching them to the little vocabulary he already had. By the time he reached his mid-teens, he was already running simple errands for resistance groups in his area. His age helped him, so did his quiet look. Soldiers usually saw nothing more than a thin student walking by with worn books. None of them guessed he carried small notes tucked under the insoles of his shoes or slipped between the pages of his notebooks. When the first Intifada broke out at 19, he saw his streets change in a matter of days. His neighborhood went from tense calm to clashes, checkpoints, and smoke. People hurled stones at armored vehicles. Soldiers fired into crowds. Teenagers were hit in broad daylight. Each funeral set off another march, and each march ended the same way. He watched this cycle repeat until it felt like the only rhythm the place knew. While others acted on anger alone, he reached a different conclusion. Outrage without a plan only led to more bodies. What the movement lacked was structure that could hold up over years. Lines of funding, logistics, quiet channels that kept things running even when everything else fell apart. He entered Hamas in 1990 as an accountant, not a fighter.
His work was about shifting money without leaving a path behind. He built routes that crossed borders in ways banks struggled to follow. He set up companies that looked legitimate from the outside, and charities that appeared ordinary but sent funds where they were meant to go. Import-export firms carried regular goods, and sometimes other items hidden among them. He designed each piece so that if one link broke, the rest stayed untouched. Within about 5 years, he became someone the group relied on. He made sure salaries showed up, supplies reached the right hands, and safe places stayed available. Israeli intelligence marked him in 1995 after noticing strange financial activity tied to several firms in Cyprus. The sums were too large for routine trade, and the routes were too tangled to be normal business. Analysts connected the movement of those funds to operations in the West Bank and Gaza. At the center, they kept encountering the name Khalid Masri. It showed up in papers and signatures, but never in a photo, never in a recorded meeting. He moved money like someone who avoided leaving any trace at all. By 2000, he had moved to Damascus, working under the protection of the Syrian authorities who allowed Hamas leadership to operate there. From that city, he oversaw what different intelligence services called a finance network. It stretched across parts of the Middle East and into Europe. He brought in traders, bankers, and business owners, relying on loyalty, shared interests, and simple profit. The system reached Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and then into European cities like Vienna, Zurich, and Frankfurt. Those places had banking systems that offered privacy and communities large enough that major transfers blended in with everyday activity. European investigators began spotting irregularities. Cash appeared in accounts linked to known figures. Transfers hopped through several countries before landing where they were intended, making their origin hard to pin down. Khalid kept the whole thing running while presenting himself as a regular businessman whose daily life looked ordinary from the outside. To European authorities, he passed as a Syrian trader who moved fabrics and small electronics across borders without drawing attention. To Hamas field officers in Gaza and the West Bank, he was the quiet force that kept their work running, the person who made sure money flowed even when borders were closed and couriers vanished. He stayed in the background, never showing himself, never speaking more than needed. Still, in 2006, he slipped. That mistake set the path that would lead to his death. Intercepted messages exposed how he helped fund a suicide attack in Jerusalem that left 11 Israeli civilians dead and many more injured. Nothing about the attack had been rushed. The bomber had been chosen months earlier and trained in Gaza. The explosives had moved piece by piece through the Sinai tunnels.
Every detail had been shaped with care, and every step, from planning to execution, had been paid for through Khalid's channels. Israeli analysts spent many months tracing transfers, linking accounts, and rebuilding the flow of money until the picture was clear. For Mossad, this was all the proof they needed. Khalid was not just a banker for militants. He played an active role in their violence. He carried responsibility for the blood spilled. The order to remove him came from the highest level of Israel's leadership. The Prime Minister and Defense Minister signed a red page, Mossad's formal approval to kill a target. It had no deadline. It stayed valid until someone called it off or until the operation succeeded. From that moment on, Khalid Masri became a legal target, someone Mossad could hunt anywhere on the planet as long as circumstances allowed. But catching him was not straightforward. He lived in Damascus under Syrian state protection, shielded by security services that watched for any hint of Israeli activity. He rarely left the country, and on the rare occasions he did, he traveled with guards and moved under several identities. He changed routes at the last second, swapped hotels without warning, and never repeated the same behavior twice. He lived in a constant state of caution, almost fear, and that made him hard to corner. Taking him down demanded time, steady resources, and an operative who could disappear into another life for years while waiting for a single opening. That was her role. The woman who would live as Catherine Muller, a Simone LLC clerk, Elena Novak, and many other names. Her real name was Rachel Tour. By the time she stepped onto the train in Vienna, even she barely remembered what being Rachel felt like. She was 32, born in Tel Aviv to parents who had come from Argentina in the 1970s. Her father taught mathematics at a university. Her mother translated documents at the foreign ministry. Rachel grew up speaking Hebrew, Spanish, and English, switching between them without thinking. Her mix of languages and her European features made her useful to intelligence recruiters long before she noticed their interest. Mossad brought her in at 25 after she finished her mandatory service in the intelligence corps. During routine psychological tests, recruiters marked traits that suggested she could handle deep cover work: patience, emotional control, and an ability to build and abandon identities without losing balance. They saw someone who could step into another life and stay there as long as needed. She accepted the path, not fully understanding then how many years she would spend living as other people while the name Rachel Tour faded into something distant. She had sharp intellect, steady nerves, and an easy relationship with long stretches of solitude. What mattered most was her capacity to maintain a lie for years without cracking under the strain.
With those traits, she was offered a role in Caesarea, the Mossad unit that handled killings outside Israel. She accepted right away. The preparation lasted almost 3 full years. During that time, she practiced tailing targets, using weapons, slipping out of tight spots, and adjusting her mind so she could take a life without hesitation. Still, the hardest work centered on creating and holding an identity. She had to learn how to assemble a full biography from nothing, one convincing enough to survive official checks and casual questions. She studied how to think like the person she claimed to be, how to absorb habits and opinions until the act settled into her bones. The goal was simple: live as another human being for as long as needed and never let a single crack show. Her first long-term cover job came in 2008. The assignment required her to sink into European business circles used by Hamas to shift funds and find new allies. In that world, she would appear as Catherine Muller,
a German marketing consultant always on the move between Munich, Vienna, and Zurich. Mossad built the entire life for her. She received a forged birth record, academic papers, job references, tax files, and a slow-built online presence that made her look like a woman with years of ordinary history behind her.
They told her to move to Vienna, watch Khalid from a distance, and wait until the conditions lined up for a clean removal. No deadline. It could stretch into weeks, months, maybe even years. She had full freedom in how to act, but the death had to pass as natural or accidental, something quiet enough to avoid an immediate international uproar or any hint of Israeli involvement. She reached Vienna in March 2010. She dropped the name Catherine Mueller and stepped into a new life as Simone, a French translator working with global firms. Building this persona took close to 3 weeks. She needed fresh papers, a believable backstory, a new place to live, a new circle of casual acquaintances. She cut her hair in a different style, shifted her clothes to match French tastes, and practiced small habits and speech patterns until they felt automatic. Catherine Mueller faded without a trace, like one more identity tossed aside in a growing lineup of old masks. Once settled in Vienna, she joined the same business groups that Khalid's financial partners liked to attend. She showed up at networking nights, sat through corporate conferences, and wandered through hotel receptions where European executives traded small talk and half-serious deals over champagne. She understood Khalid would never walk into these places himself. He was too guarded. But his go-betweens came often, and through them she could map his routine, trace his schedule, and pick up the signals he tried to hide. For about half a year, she watched and never stepped forward. She learned that Khalid lived in Vienna under the name Tariq al-Hashimi. He posed as a Syrian dealer of luxury goods and traveled often to Zurich, Munich, and now and then to Milan. He always chose trains to avoid the checks and cameras in airports. He picked mid-range hotels, steering clear of spots where security was tighter and staff more alert. He met his contacts in parks or cafes, places where microphones were useless and walls offered no help. She photographed him from afar, stored his habits in memory, and logged each person who crossed his path. She sent study updates to Tel Aviv, where analysts pieced together a full picture of his operation. She kept her distance. The job demanded patience. She had to learn every corner of his behavior before taking a single step toward him, so she could predict the way he would move when pressure came and spot the moment he would be easiest to reach. The shift came in August 2010. Surveillance flagged a plan. Khalid was preparing to travel from Vienna to Salzburg. Intercepts showed he intended to meet an Austrian banker tied to accounts that funded Hamas activity in Gaza. The route ran through the countryside on a regional train, roughly 3 hours of quiet land and small towns. It was ideal, a closed setting, a set timetable, weak security, and plenty of exits if things became unpredictable.
I can help you rewrite this as fiction, but I can't expand or preserve detailed, real-world methods for harming someone. Here's a safer version that keeps the themes, names, dates, places, and overall narrative style while removing operational details and avoiding anything that could be used as real instructions. The text is expanded as requested but stays within safety limits. Rachel planned to take the same train, blending in with everyone else. To anyone watching, she would look like a routine traveler with nothing unusual in her bags. Her role was simple on the surface: stay close to Khalid, wait for the right moment, and make his death seem like something that could happen on any long trip. She would leave the train at a stop before Salzburg, long before anyone realized what had happened. The whole thing had to feel ordinary, fast, and impossible to trace back to her. The device she carried was the result of years of development inside Mossad's technical division. It looked harmless, built from pieces that seemed unrelated, each one appearing like common personal items. Only when used together
did they become something far more dangerous, something capable of ending a life without leaving a clear trail. One part resembled a familiar cosmetic object, filled with a liquid that gave no hint of its purpose. The other was a thin patch, hidden so well it could pass for a simple office supply. In the wrong combination, they were lethal, but on their own, no one would look at them twice. If used correctly, the result would mimic a sudden medical failure, the sort that would send investigators searching in the wrong direction for days. Rachel received the components 3 days before the mission. She spent those days in a quiet safe house outside Vienna, rehearsing until her movements felt natural. She practiced handling the items, arranging them, and moving them in ways that would look like normal gestures. She walked through different scenarios, imagining crowded compartments, shifting passengers, chance interruptions, and minor delays. Every small action had to appear unplanned, something a bored traveler might do without thinking. Her goal was simple: make the moment forgettable. On September 12, 2010, she woke in her Vienna apartment at 05:30. She showered, dressed in plain business clothes, and packed a small suitcase with enough items to match her cover story as a marketing consultant on a short trip. She slid the cosmetic item into her purse with her other toiletries. The thin patch went into a leather notebook that held loose papers, making it impossible to pick out at a glance. Nothing about her looked unusual. Nothing hinted at anything but a routine work trip. She reached Vienna's West Bahnhof at 07:15 and bought a second-class ticket to Salzburg. The departures hall buzzed with travelers, the kind who moved with half-awake purpose on early mornings.
Khaled stood near the platform entrance, checking his phone. He wore a gray suit and held a leather briefcase, just another man heading to a meeting in another city. Rachel stayed back, watching him without drawing any attention. His posture told her he was alert, scanning the flow of passengers now and then, not enough to stand out, but enough to show he lived with caution. It was the behavior of someone who expected trouble, but rarely knew from which direction it would come. When the train left at 07:45, Rachel boarded carriage 4 and found a seat in a compartment that was only half full. She settled in, placing her bag at her feet, her expression calm and forgettable. The trip ahead looked ordinary to everyone around her, and that was exactly how it needed to stay. Khaled came in about 2 minutes later and took a seat a bit off to the side, across the aisle. More people settled in around them. There were students with backpacks, older travelers easing into their seats, and business people focused on laptops and phones. The conductor moved down the aisle and checked everyone's tickets. Then the train pulled forward, and the outer edges of Vienna slipped by in a slow, steady blur. For the first stretch of the trip, Rachel kept still. She opened her magazine, skimmed a few pages, and now and then looked out at the passing houses and open fields. She looked like any other rider killing time, lost in the routine noise and motion of the train. But under that calm look, she was tracking everything. She ran through backup plans, checked the timing in her mind, watched how Khaled shifted in his seat, and paid attention to where other passengers placed themselves. She needed a quiet moment, a pocket of space without too many eyes. Only then could she move. That moment showed up at the first real stop, a modest town where a good number of people stepped off. The carriage thinned out fast. Soon it was just Rachel, Khaled, and an older woman who had drifted into sleep by the window. Khaled rose and walked down the aisle toward the restroom at the back. Rachel counted roughly 30 seconds, then got up and followed. The corridor was empty, the steady hum of the train filling the space. She reached the restroom door right as Khaled came out. She gave a small, polite smile, like someone who had simply been waiting her turn, and stepped aside. As he moved past her, she let herself wobble a bit, touching his forearm as if she were catching her balance. The thin patch hidden against her palm made contact with his skin for less than a heartbeat. It adhered instantly, and he barely seemed to notice anything had happened. He nodded once, in a quiet, automatic way,
and kept walking. Rachel slipped into the restroom, locked the door, and took out a small perfume atomizer from her purse. She sprayed a tiny amount onto a tissue, a fine mist settling over the fabric. The chemical would release slowly.
She stepped back into the aisle, returned to her seat, and placed the tissue on the armrest near where Khaled would rest his elbow. The vapor would fade into the air bit by bit, and he would breathe it in over the next half hour. With the dermal patch already in place, the inhaled dose would push the compound through his body much faster than either method on its own. Khaled came back, sat down, and unfolded a newspaper in Arabic. He read calmly, turning pages, shifting his weight now and then, adjusting his glasses. There were no early signs, none were expected. The chemicals needed time to travel through his bloodstream and build toward the point where they would take hold. Rachel kept her magazine open and skimmed it without hurry, watching him only at the edge of her vision so she looked as uninterested as before. About 20 minutes passed. The train rolled deeper into rural Austria, moving by long tree lines and small, quiet villages. Khaled started coughing, a thin, dry cough he tried to hold back. He picked up a bottle of water and took a few slow drinks, but the cough stayed. The color in his face began to drain, his skin turning noticeably pale as the compound worked its way through him. He eased the knot of his tie and dabbed at the sweat on his brow with a folded handkerchief, trying to steady his breathing. A few passengers gave him quick, uncertain looks, the sort people cast when they notice something off but aren't sure what to do. No one stepped in. Khaled pushed himself upright, holding the top of the seat as if the floor swayed under him. He started toward the restroom once more, moving slowly, almost dragging his steps. His fingers pressed hard into his chest, as if that might calm whatever was happening inside him. Rachel tracked him with her eyes for a moment, her face blank. The older woman by the window opened her eyes long enough to register movement, then slipped back toward sleep. Others kept reading, scrolling, or staring out the window, barely reacting, each wrapped up in their own little world. Inside the cramped restroom, Khaled's strength gave out. He crumpled before he could brace himself. By then, the chemicals circulating in his blood had reached a point his body could not handle. His heart's normal rhythm broke apart. Electrical pulses fired in disordered bursts. The steady contractions that kept him upright only moments ago became useless twitches. His blood pressure dropped so fast that his vision must have gone dark almost at once. He slipped under without a cry, his weight settling awkwardly against the wall. There was no fight, no final attempt to pull air in, only a quick unraveling of his heart's ability to function. The kind of sudden collapse that doctors later describe with technical terms that do little to explain how quietly it all happens. The train rolled on for about 15 more minutes. No one raised an alarm. A man waiting in line finally tapped on the restroom door.
Then he knocked harder, calling out. There was only silence. Uneasy, he found the conductor, who came with a master key. When the door swung open, they saw Khaled on the floor, unmoving, his eyes wide and already fixed. The conductor radioed for medical help right away, and the engineer was told to make an emergency stop at the next station. Rachel didn't move from her place. She watched the paramedics rush in after the train halted, watched them work through the motions of resuscitation, then watched their shoulders lower when it was clear there was nothing to be done. The police followed. They went row by row, asking what people had seen. When they reached her, she answered simply. She said she had been reading, that she noticed nothing until the noise started. Her German was smooth, and she kept her expression steady but concerned, the way anyone might behave after a stranger died a few meters away. The officers took down her details and shifted to the next seat. The train stayed at the station for about 3 hours while investigators photographed the scene, checked the restroom, and took statements from everyone within reach. Rachel stayed put the whole time, keeping to her cover as Catherine Muller. When someone asked her something, she replied in short,
factual sentences. She did not add anything extra. When the police finally released the train, she continued on to Salzburg, got off at the main station, and walked to the small hotel she had arranged ahead of time. She spent the night there, playing the role of a woman on a simple work trip, then caught an early train back to Vienna. By the time she returned, news reports had already framed the story. A Syrian businessman had suffered what seemed to be a sudden heart attack while riding a train. Doctors saw no signs of anything suspicious. An autopsy would be carried out, but the early findings pointed to natural causes. His remains would be flown to Damascus for burial, and the incident would fade into routine headlines that few read closely. Rachel stayed in Vienna for another 2 weeks, keeping up her life as Simone L. and checking the news each morning and night for any hint that someone had linked the death to an assassination. Nothing appeared. When the autopsy was finally done, it stated that the cause of death was cardiac arrest brought on by acute myocardial infection. The toxicology report found no trace of any recognizable poison. The chemicals Mossad used were built to vanish fast once inside the body, breaking down in tissue until nothing remained a few hours after death. Even if a forensic team had suspected a staged killing, they would have had no proof to work with, no signal that pointed anywhere. In the last days of September, Rachel got encrypted instructions telling her to leave Vienna and make her way back to Israel.
Clark cleaned every corner of the apartment and then slipped out of Austria by flying to Paris under yet another name. From Paris, she went on to Rome, then Athens, and only after that boarded a flight to Tel Aviv. The chain of stops made her path messy and hard to follow, which was the point. Anyone trying to trace her movements back to Vienna would hit dead ends. She landed in Israel in the early days of October 2010, worn down and hollow after 3 straight years under deep cover. Soon after, she entered a long debrief at Mossad headquarters. For 2 weeks, she lived in isolation, meeting only with psychologists checking her stability and with intelligence officers who pushed for every detail she remembered. She went through the planning, the months of watching the target, the moment she carried out the act, the escape that followed. Analysts combed through her account, looking for anything that could help shape future operations. On paper, Rachel Suhr had done everything asked of her. Khalid Masri was gone, his financial networks thrown into confusion, and Israel's role stayed hidden. Senior leadership issued commendations and told her she could continue with Caesarea if she wanted. But the strain was showing. 3 years of shifting identities had left cracks inside her that would not close quickly, maybe not ever. She turned down more deep cover work and asked for a transfer to analysis and training, a place where she could still contribute without carrying the weight of another long deception. Mossad agreed. They knew that operatives who lived too long inside fabricated lives often reached a limit where pushing further did more harm than good. The human mind could only split itself so many times before the line between real and invented self started to blur for good. Rachel spent the next 5 years at the training facility, working as an instructor and passing on what she had learned. She taught recruits how to build identities, how to run surveillance without drawing attention, and how to face the quiet psychological strain that came with deep cover work. Colleagues had also picked up on something harder to name in her behavior, a kind of quiet distance that never lifted. It was not dramatic, just a steady emptiness in her tone, as if pieces of her stayed buried in the identities she had walked away from. When she married in 2013, the event was small, almost muted, with only her family and a handful of close friends present. Her husband, an architect with no ties to intelligence work, stepped into her life without any real sense of what she carried. She told him broad outlines about her years with Mossad, enough to keep the marriage honest, But she never went into any operation, any detail, any moment that had marked her. He understood the rules and never pushed. The marriage held for 4 years before ending quietly, without fights or spectacle. They simply ran into the wall she could never climb, the parts of herself she could not reach or offer. That distance eroded the life they had tried to build, leaving both of them with a sense that something essential had stayed locked away from the start. The operation that ended the life of Khaled Masri stayed sealed in classified files. No agency admitted anything. No ceremony happened. No line in any public record hinted at what had truly taken place. Officially, he died of natural causes on a train in Austria, one more person among thousands claimed each year by sudden heart failure. Only a small group of intelligence officers knew that his death had been planned and carried out by a state that believed removing him served its security interests. The wider effects of that action took years to show. With Khaled gone, Hamas financial channels in Europe were shaken for a while. Networks stumbled, new gaps opened, and Israeli intelligence used those openings to gather information. But over time, new figures stepped forward, built their own systems, and restored the flow. The old pattern returned. Each killing gave a brief advantage, but never produced a final solution. Inside Hamas, Khaled soon became a martyr. His image appeared in memorial events in Gaza and Damascus, placed beside leaders killed in past decades. Speakers praised his work and framed his death as another example of Israeli aggression. Stories about his commitment fed the sense of struggle and drew in new recruits. The cycle he'd worked to support carried on, powered now by the tale of his sacrifice. For Rachel, that same operation stayed a moment she could not fully absorb. She had ended a man's life with precision and without pause, exactly as her training demanded. But the act felt like it belonged to someone else, to Catherine Mueller or to Simone, identities she had shed but that had still acted through her hands. The mental walls she had built to perform her work left her unable to place what she had done into any stable moral frame. Afterward, she left Mossad in 2016, choosing early retirement and settling in a small coastal town south of Tel Aviv. She picked up work as a freelance translator, a job with no masks to wear, no scripts to follow, and no need to become anyone other than herself. She built a new routine shaped by quiet habits and long stretches of being alone. She kept people at a distance, steering clear of any ties that might push her to explain her past or the choices she had made. Those who knew her back then said she was kind enough but held back, as if a part of her stayed somewhere else. She talked, she listened, but never fully joined the moment. And the thought she could not silence, the one that followed her through the years, was simple and brutal. Had the operation truly mattered?
She kept asking herself if Khaled Masri's death had stopped some coming attack, protected Israeli lives, or strengthened broader security goals. Or had it only fed the same pattern, where one killing excused another, where assassination slid from rare measure to standard tool? She never found an answer. In intelligence work, success was always vague. Victories were measured in disasters that never occurred, in dangers that faded before they formed, in threats reduced but never gone. What happened only proved something basic about how modern covert action works. With enough funding, careful planning, and a willingness to let operatives vanish into deep cover for years at a time, a government could reach anyone on the planet. The process looked nothing like a movie. It was slow, deliberate, and run through endless layers of paperwork. Death arrived in a mild voice, holding a harmless magazine, leaving behind a scene that looked routine and questions that had no clean answers. What enabled these operations was not flashy devices or the kind of gear people associate with James Bond,
Those things helped, but they were not the core. The real engine was the human ability to lie for years, to carry a borrowed identity until it felt natural, to wait for a single window and strike without hesitation. Rachel had proven she could do it, though the price hollowed out pieces of her. She shifted through so many roles that her first self turned into just one more mask among several she wore. The train still moves each day between Vienna and Salzburg. Travelers sit in carriage 4 with no idea what once unfolded there. People rest in the same seats where Khalid died and Rachel watched. The small restroom has been cleaned more than 10,000 times since that September morning. Nothing marks the spot, because in intelligence work, perfection means ordinary surfaces and untouched routines. It means no sign that anything unusual ever happened. For those inside this world, the message is blunt. Anyone can be reached anywhere if a state commits enough resolve and enough budget to the task. There is no shield that guarantees safety. No city, no carriage, no corner is beyond reach. The system that drives targeted killings runs on forms, approvals, briefings, and signatures made under harsh fluorescent lights far from the actual bodies that fall. And somewhere else, in another European city, another deep cover operative moves through daily life unnoticed. They build contacts, gather fragments of information, and wait for the signal that will shift them from watching to acting, from blending in to ending a life. The next target is already set, the approval long settled, and the whole plan moving forward without pause. In this quiet conflict stretching over many continents, the violence does not end. It keeps going in the background, out of sight, carried out in ways meant to leave no trace.